Welcome to this session on the blues revival and the British invasion, and also 1960s country music. So we're covering a few different branches of 1960s musical expression. And once again, just like we did with the last couple sessions where we were kind of juxtaposing the British invasion element of the Beatles with the Beach Boys and their response to that, we'll see some elements of that here with the 1960s country music as a response to the British invasion and a response to the incursions of rock and popular music in general, other forms of popular music in general. Prior to 1964, Britain imported far more music from America than it exported, right? So it brought far more in than it sent out. Indeed, one of the biggest hits by a UK artist in the US was Hayley Mills' Let's Get Together from the Disney film The Parent Trap, 1961. And obviously that was a Disney film, so that was a film produced in the US just featuring a British actress and singer. That was one of the biggest hits by a UK artist in the US. That's 1961. So Beatlemania really changes everything about the relationship between British musical artists and the American commercial market, the U.S. commercial market. Beatlemania, which starts hitting the U.S. in 64, changes all of that. So it particularly when they held all 5 of the highest positions on the Billboard's charts, which we talked about during their session. Dusty Springfield was one of the first to follow the success of the Beatles with the song I Only Want to Be With You, which was number 12 in 1964. And soon the British bands were occupying roughly half of the higher portions of the Billboard Top 100. So half of the top 50 by the end of 64 were occupied by British bands. So that's kind of reversing the entire situation. Previously in Britain, the charts were dominated by imports from the U.S., but now the charts in the U.S. are dominated by imports from Britain. And there were many bands that emulated the Beatles, and then many bands that were quite different from the Beatles, but still sort of rode those coattails in various ways. So these are Beatle-like bands, right? There's Jerry and the Pacemakers, and you can see them down in the corner there, with the song Don't Let the Sun Catch You Crying. Billy J. Kramer, Do You Want to Know a Secret, which was actually written by Lennon and McCartney. The Dave Clark Five, and you can see them in the upper right corner with the song Glad All Over. They had other hit tunes as well. Herman's Hermits, one of their big ones was Mrs. Brown, You've Got a Lovely Daughter. And that's them with him with his hand over his eyes there in the upper corner. And then the Hollies with Bus Stop, and Freddie and the Dreamers, I'm Telling You Now, right? The Hollies are pictured in the bottom corner there, bottom left, or right rather. Many of these bands drew directly on the Beatles. As you can see, some of them even used songs written by the Beatles. Many of them, like Herman's Hermits, would kind of exaggerate to some extent their accents, which made them kind of novelty hits in the U.S., and you can hear that on several of their songs, including Mrs. Brown. So these are bands that are impacting the U.S. market in part by highlighting their otherness, by highlighting the fact that they're novel and new and from elsewhere. But then you have another element of the British invasion, which winds up being in some ways the more influential element, even though it wasn't the more popular one at first. And that is the more blues driven part of the British invasion. And a lot of that goes back to this guy, Alexis Korner, and what he called Blues Incorporated. He was heavily influenced by Chicago blues, and he was part of this London blues revival. In fact, in some ways, he starts the London blues revival. Alexis Korner was key to the renewed interest in the blues. He and a harmonica player named Cyril Davies were playing at the Marquee Club, and they began recording in 1962 as Blues Incorporated. Now, this wasn't exactly a band. It was kind of a loose-knit group of jamming musicians. And the only constants, the only people who were on all the recordings and on pretty much all the live dates would have been Corner himself and then Davies, Cyril Davies. Davies then leaves in 62, but Corner continues. So really, when we talk about Blues Incorporated, we're talking about Alexis Corner. But that doesn't mean that the other musicians weren't important, because he wound up working with a ton of really important blues musicians, and he influenced a ton more. So the album that they put out is R&B from the Marquee. Remember that they're playing a regular gig at the Marquee in 1962, and that features Davies and Long John Baldry on vocals. And Long John Baldry has a pretty distinctive voice if you listen to anything by him, especially from that album. And this album was celebrated by blues enthusiasts, even though it never really gained commercial prominence. Corner was critical of what he saw as the over-reliance on Chicago blues, and he maintained a kind of purist stance. He advocated more eclecticism. He wanted people to draw on more styles of blues than just the Chicago blues of Muddy Waters, although he was obviously highly influenced by Muddy Waters, and you can hear that in his playing. So he was influential on a whole range, a whole generation really, of guitarists in England, partly because he was so knowledgeable. And so one of the things that Jimmy Page, for instance, admired about him was that he could say, well, this is in the style of Muddy Waters, but this is in the style of, I don't know, Son House or whatever. And he was able to do things in these various styles and draw on them. And as you know, or as you will know, in the second half of this semester, Jimmy Page was also very eclectic in his influences and the things he was able to emulate. So Alexis Corner winds up influencing artists and groups like Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, the Rolling Stones, Cream, Free, John Mayall, and Rod Stewart. Some of these people actually played from time to time with Alexis Corner, as we'll see. That's true, for instance, of members of the Rolling Stones. So let's talk about the Rolling Stones. They're the bad boy alternative to the Beatles. Brian Jones was the original leader of the band, and he played regularly with Alexis Corner. Then there's Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Jagger and Richards got together in 61 as the Blues Boys, and they sent a tape to Alexis Corner, and he was impressed. So Jagger and Richards begins jamming with Blues Incorporated, which at that time had Brian Jones on slide guitar. And also pianist Ian Stewart and drummer Charlie Watts. So pretty much everybody is jamming with Alexis Corner, and that's how they come together. So these musicians, this group, breaks off to create a Chicago blues style band. And then in 1963, they have a regular gig at the Crawdaddy Club, and you can see them playing at the Crawdaddy Club in that picture. In May of 63, they hire Andrew Loog Oldham as their manager. And that's a picture of him. He was only 19 at the time, so he had to have his mother co-sign everything. He wasn't legally old enough to sign contracts. He wanted the band to be entirely distinct from the Beatles. So he begins basically just writing press releases that suggest that the Rolling Stones are everything the Beatles were not, right? So he basically wrote a list of attributes that he thought applied to the Beatles, and then he took the opposite of that and applied it to the Rolling Stones. So he calls them a raunchy, gamey, unpredictable bunch of undesirables. He was trying to establish that the Stones were threatening, uncouth, and animalistic. Oldham signs them to a deal with Decca, and the band retains ownership of their recordings. This is a 19-year-old who was smart enough to do something that most managers at that time, including Epstein for the Beatles, were unable to do. Right? Epstein had a lot more experience than Andrew Loog Oldham, but Oldham negotiated a contract with Decca which was far superior to the original contract the Beatles had with EMI. So they owned their recordings. That's vitally important, and you're gonna hear me mention this over and over again when bands manage to do it. And so because I keep mentioning it, you may think, oh, well, it's fairly common. It's not at all common. I'm mentioning it because it is not common, because it is so important for them to retain ownership over the recordings. For the most part, what happens is the record companies have the ownership of the masters, which means that they can put out as many best ofs as they want. They can do it whenever there's licensing for a film, they get to make those decisions. Licensing for commercials, they get to make those decisions. Sometimes they're kind enough to ask the artist what he or she thinks, but not always, right? So having ownership over your own masters allows you all sorts of freedom. Let's say that a record company that you recorded with doesn't feel like putting out a best of for whatever reason, but some other record company is willing to pay you to put out the best of, right? You might want to take that offer. You can if you own your masters. You can if you don't. As we'll talk about much later, Paul McCartney found this out when Michael Jackson purchased the masters for the publishing rights for the Beatles, right? You need to own your masters, you need to own your publishing rights, and a lot of artists do not. So whenever they do manage to negotiate that, I will be making a big deal out of it, because it is a big deal. Their early hits were all covers, right? And Oldham says, look, if you really want to make money, you're going to make money not just from the recordings, but from the publishing rights. And that's the other aspect of this, right? And you only have any purchase on publishing rights if you are a publisher or if you are a songwriter, copyright, right? When you're doing a cover, you're making money off of the recording, but so is the person who actually wrote the song. So you're losing that part of the income to them. So they start writing their own songs. Basically, he says he figuratively locks them in a room, and Richards and Jagger come up with The Last Time, 1965, which is a pop number 9 in the US and a UK number 1. It's their first original song, and it's written by Richards and Jagger. They become the songwriting team, and Jones is sidelined. Brian Jones doesn't really want them to be an original band. He wants them to continue in the blues tradition of doing other people's songs, maybe writing a few originals, but basically reworking old blues songs. So he becomes less important as they become an original band. In May of 65, they release I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which is still one of their most famous songs. That's a pop number 1 and an R&B 19 and a UK number 1. I don't know why I didn't include that. And that has the very famous guitar riff, right? Supposedly, Keith Richards, he kept a little tape recorder next to his bed, and late at night when he was drunk or high, he would play and record the things he was playing. And supposedly he woke up one morning not remembering anything from the night before, heard the lick, and then had to figure it out. It's not a terribly hard lick to figure out. Yeah, it's a very catchy, very simple lick. Gets in your head. It's a kind of earworm, right? And it's one of the most famous rock songs of all time. Then they put out the album Aftermath in the spring of 66, and it's composed entirely of Jagger and Richards songs. It has Jones playing sitar on Paint It Black, one of their great tunes, and dulcimer on Lady Jane, and marimba on Under My Thumb. So Jones is now the sort of multi-instrumentalist of the group. The song Mother's Little Helper is another great tune that's on the album, on the UK version of the album anyway. So this is a song full of really classic songs, early songs by the Rolling Stones. Then they put out a string of classic albums, right? There's Beggar's Banquet from 68. There's Let It Bleed from 69. Sticky Fingers, which of course has the famous photograph of Mick Jagger's pants, basically, and in the original design, which was by the famous artist Andy Warhol, you could actually lower the zipper, right? So it was a kind of interactive album cover. That caused all sorts of problems, as you can imagine, because albums are supposed to be flat, so you can put them all next to each other. If you jam too many albums in and one of them, and they have zippers, then you're breaking the album that's ahead of it. So it caused all sorts of problems, and they later removed it. But for the first pressing, you could actually move his zipper. If you buy an album, even from the second pressing now, then no, you won't have that pleasure. And then, of course, in 72, they released Exile on Main Street. Exile on Main Street's, to many people, their most celebrated album, especially for the people who are kind of purists It's one of their least commercial albums, and yet it's one of their most celebrated because it's very lo-fi in the way they recorded it. They basically segregated themselves into a hotel room or a house of some sort, and then they just recorded this album, making up the songs as they went. There are a few songs that you'd probably recognize from it, but for the most part, it's composed of songs that are kind of fan favorites without being huge radio singles. But it was thought of by many people as being their return to form. And then after that, they kind of drift into other areas. They have disco releases and so on, things that at least I'm a little less interested in. But if you're interested in that, that might be something you can write about for your term paper. December 6th, 1969, they hold a concert at Altamont Raceway, which is meant to be a kind of their response to Woodstock. The idea is for it to be a free concert and for them to film it. They're having themselves filmed as part of a documentary. So they have just like Woodstock had the very famous documentary, and we're going to talk about that in an upcoming session. Part of what made Woodstock so celebrated was the Michael Wadley film, right? And that's part of what makes it so iconic. Well, this is a period where with more and more concert films, Pennebaker is filming, for instance, Monterey Festival. He also is filming Bob Dylan, and so this is supposed to be a concert film rather, of the Rolling Stones. So they're going to do this concert for free, but everything pretty much goes wrong from the beginning. First of all, they secure the location way too late. Even Woodstock felt that it secured its location too late, that it was only a minor miracle that they were able to get in the porta potties and all the rest of the things that they needed in order to secure that space, in order to make it somewhat safe. But as you know, it was declared a disaster area, or as you will know when we discuss Woodstock in more detail. And yet, there were only, I forget how many, I think only 2 deaths or something like that, and none of them directly related to the concert. For the most part, people at Woodstock took care of each other. It worked out. But that's lightning in a bottle. You're not going to capture that twice, So with Altamont, they were trying to hope that it would work out that way again. They had a space that then was removed from their ability to use it, and they wound up making the deal with Altamont Speedway Raceway. They made it in a few days before. Right? Then they had to get the contract for the porta potties. They had to get security. And what they did is they hired Hell's Angels. Not the best security force. And what they did is they paid them roughly $500 in beer to do it. So there's a stabbing occurs while the band was playing their set, and they get crucified by Rolling Stone magazine for their mismanagement of the whole thing. And we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about the rock festivals. But this is a low point for the Rolling Stones, and to many people's minds, after Exile, they become a little less interesting as a kind of cultural force. Again, I'm open to people suggesting otherwise. I know there are some rabid Rolling Stone fans who think that the late 70s and 80s are a great period for them. So that could be something you can write about. The Animals, heavily influenced by Alexis Korner. Many musicians wind up following this trend of that Korner influence. So there's John Mayall, there's Steve Winwood, of course, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, John McLaughlin. The first group to really break through from this subculture was The Animals, featuring Eric Burdon as the singer with his really great throwback to the early blues kind of voice. And they had a song with the cover. They had a hit with the cover of House of the Rising Sun, which was a UK number 6 and a pop number 7. It's one of the more famous examples of the Manchester sound, and that would be something that you can look into for part of the midterm, as you can look at the midterm guidelines and see that one of the things that you could write an outline about is the Manchester sound, and that would be partly about the Animals, of course. And of course, Eric Clapton is one of the most important guitarists of this scene. He was in the Yardbirds until their breakout hit, For Your Love. Then he joins John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. And he didn't stay long in that group, but the album Blues Breakers, John Mayall with Eric Clapton, which was released in '66, is a major release and really makes his reputation. Part of what's famous about that is just how loud of an album it is. For the most part, when you were recording albums, even in the mid 60s, even the Beatles, even the Beach Boys, you were going direct into the board with little or no real amplification in the studio, right? With your guitars, what I'm talking about is guitars and basses. So you're going direct into the mixing board. There might have been some effects or whatever, but your volume was very carefully controlled. So that eliminated feedback. Feedback could be produced in the studio in various ways, but it was a different kind of feedback. It sapped the guitar sound of some of its energy. Well, Clapton wasn't having it. He wanted his Marshall amplifier to be used on the recording to sound in its full presence, and not only to be there, but to be cranked up. So there are all sorts of feedback problems that they had during the recording of this album, and they had to mic it very carefully and so on, but it was worth it. If you listen to this album, the sound of the guitar on it is amazing. It's a very different kind of energy than you have in anything before that, before the, let's say 65, 66, when it was recorded and then released. So there's a barely controlled but energetic sound that he gets there. Soon you see graffiti all over London saying Clapton is God. He's really revered as one of the great guitarists of the period. And, later goes on to Derek and the Dominoes and all these various groups that are really just solo efforts, more or less. And with the song Layla, of course, by them. He does a solo on As My Guitar Gently Weeps by the Beatles, which I think is one of his great solos. Eric Clapton, to me, is kind of hit or miss. Some albums are amazing, like the Blues Breakers album, and then some albums are maybe more celebrated than they're worth to me. But some of the stuff that he does with Cream is quite impressive. And then, of course, I think that solo on My Guitar Gently Weeps, although for some reason some Beatles fans really hate that solo. I think it's a great little work of art and is worth listening to carefully. Then you have the Kinks. They more or less define power chord rock with the song You Really Got Me in '64, and then All Day and All the Night in '65. Many of their later songs are so involved in British references that the U.S. seems to have lost interest, but they are one of the great quirky bands of that era. They become a huge influence on later indie rock, like Ockerville River and so on, so partly because of their quirkiness, and they're worth checking out. I think that they sort of didn't get the reputation that perhaps they deserved, other than for these few big tunes. Now let's talk about country music in the 1960s. Country music is moving away from the mainstream for the majority of the 60s. Remember that in the 50s, we had, in the post-war era, basically, you had honky tonk, which was commercially successful. It brought in more electric instruments. You had bluegrass, which wasn't as commercially successful. That was the sort of bid for traditional sounds, even though it was less traditional in its appropriation of jazz and its energy. Then you had the country crooners, which was incredibly commercial, to the point that many of the big country crooners weren't really country artists in the traditional sense, and those that were didn't necessarily sound like country artists, like Eddie Arnold, for instance. He was a country artist. He grew up within the country tradition. He was working on the Grand Ole Opry and so on, but he doesn't, if you just listen to his recordings, there aren't a whole lot of country signifiers on a lot of those recordings. He sounds like a pop singer. And then you have other singers like Bing Crosby and so on who are clearly pop singers doing, or Dean Martin, right, doing these country songs, but they're clearly pop singers. And then you have the Nashville sound in the 50s, which is a response to rock and roll and Chet Atkins and this whole increased effort in the studio to make it sound, the distinction between the rock and roll of Elvis and the Nashville sound of, say, Jim Reeves, there's not a whole lot they're using the same background singers, they're using the same instrumentalists, the same sounds. So that southern rock and roll sound, the rockabilly sound, and the country sound, they become very close for a while there in the second half of the 50s. So the 50s are the great period of country really emerging into the mainstream. For a while, around the time of the late 40s, early 50s, country was one of the best selling. It was selling roughly a third of the music industry's income came from, or I should say that a better way, roughly a third of the music industry's income came from country music. So there was an explosion of interest in the late 40s and 50s in country music. It really was a commercially viable, a richly commercially viable, not a niche market kind of music anymore. But now in the 60s, there's a kind of backlash to that. There's a withdrawal from the mainstream. There were far fewer crossover hits. There were still some, but there were far fewer, right? Patsy Cline's Crazy was a country number 2, and it was a pop number 9. That's high in 1961. That's a crossover. And then you had other artists like Jim Reeves, Floyd Kramer, right? Floyd Kramer really didn't have any strong crossovers. Loretta Lynn had a few, but it really was much higher on the country charts. Merle Haggard, George Jones, Buck Owens, Johnny Cash, Charlie Pride, who just passed away. So those who were in the country, the 60s are a great moment, but it's a moment of kind of more traditionalism, more building up a truly country artist, an audience, rather than a crossover or a mainstream audience. So Patsy Cline, she's one of the most influential vocalists and one of the first crossover artists that goes from the country charts to the pop charts, as opposed to the other way around. There were plenty of crossover country artists before in the opposite sense, in the sense that, Bing Crosby, Dean Martin, Peggy Lee, they all had country hits, but they were coming from the pop side of things and then doing a country hit. She's one of the first to be grounded in the country tradition and have pop hits. The other, of course, is Eddie Arnold. But again, he's kind of in this interstitial space. Is he really country or is he pop all along? It's hard to say. She began singing on WINC in Virginia when she was 15, and by 54 she had a contract with the 4-Star label and a minor success with a pretty nice song called A Church, A Courtroom, and Goodbye, 55. Then another one with I've Loved and Lost Again in 56. In 57, she appears on TV on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, and she's singing a song that she didn't even really want to record called Walking After Midnight. And you'll hear it's very much, if you listen to that song, it's very much in that Nashville sound. It's borrowing some rock guitar elements and so on. And it becomes her first crossover hit. In 1958, she moves to Nashville. She's working with the manager, Randy Hughes, and the producer, Owen Bradley. Bradley is one of the architects of the Nashville sound, along with Chet Atkins, so that high production value, drawing on certain elements of rock and pop sounds, especially the backup singers, right? The Jordanaires and these other famous backup singing groups that they use. They're at Decca at this time in 1960. And in 1961, she releases I Fall to Pieces and then Crazy, which Crazy is of course a major hit for her with that reverb and echo and this huge sound, her soaring voice on it is a huge hit written by, actually it's a song composed and written by Willie Nelson. He brought the demo to her and he does it in his own sort of way. It's a much sort of softer song in his version of it. She makes it into this sort of soaring, almost aria-like tune. She dies in a plane crash in 1963. But the influence that she leaves behind really belies the brevity of her career. Now, in the late 50s, in Bakersfield, California, and there you see a shot, aerial shot of Bakersfield, you have the rise of the Bakersfield sound. This is the first genre to be influenced by the sound of rock and roll more than the production values of rock and roll that inspired the Nashville sound around the same time. But the Bakersfield sound is something different. The Bakersfield sound is very interesting because what it does is it takes rock elements And it makes them into country signifiers. So it's taking the electric guitar, but it's creating a country twang version of it, right? It's a much more electric instrumentation, but not just the slide guitar. In fact, they sometimes not even using the slide guitar like we saw in Honky Tonk last semester, but rather the electric guitar, the Fender sound, that Strat sound, amplified, the much more presence of the drums and an emphasis on the backbeat is not nearly as slick in its production as the Nashville sound. There's a raw energy to it. It becomes one of the most popular country genres of the 60s and was thought of as kind of a revival of honky tonk music, and it becomes an influence on country rock and then outlaw country later. And Merle Haggard especially is an influence on outlaw country. And we'll see that, of course, we'll see how that influences the outlaw country artists. So let's take a closer look at some Bakersfield sound recordings. The early progenitors, 1954. You have Bud Hobbs doing Louisiana Swing. Now, that has Buck Owens on lead guitar, and we're going to come back to Buck Owens. He's a very important figure for us in this genre. This is, and also Bill Woods on piano. And listen to the song, you'll hear that he announces both Buck Owens and Bill Woods. He makes a big deal out of their contributions to the song. This is considered the first song in the Bakersfield sound style. Both Woods and Owens get featured solos, and they're announced, like I said. Owens' guitar sound is particularly important. It's not at all typical in country prior to this, but it becomes a kind of electric guitar country sound, thanks to Buck Owens. Win Stewart is another early innovator, although he had relatively little commercial success. Now, Buck Owens starts his own group called the Buck Owens and his Buckaroos. They're one of the first significant bands to exemplify the sound of the Bakersfield sound. The drums are very upfront in the mix, which is not typical. It's not that there were no drums in any country tunes before. Even some bluegrass albums, like by Flatt and Scruggs, had some of that, some of the drums, but they were usually with brushes, and they were mixed way into the back. There wasn't a lot of cymbal work. It was usually just brushes on the snare, and an occasional rather soft bass drum hit. Here, the drums are much more upfront, like a rock band. And then you have the high two-part vocal harmonies, Owens, and the guitarist Don Rich. And then Don Rich with that twangy electric guitar. Buck Owens is a great guitarist. Don Rich is an excellent guitarist. Don Rich is an amazing guitarist. And you should listen to some of their live stuff, especially, to get a sense of just how amazing they were. They had an early hit, a number 3 country hit, in 1960 with Above and Beyond, and then in 1963 they recorded Act Naturally, which was a number 1 and soon to be covered by the Beatles with Ringo singing. From 1969 to 86, he co-hosted along with Roy Clark Hee Haw on CBS. And there again, you have this. Hee Haw is a very interesting television show. I mean, by today's standards, it's nothing but stereotypes and kind of low humor. And by those standards, by the standards of the 70s, really, it was already low humor and stereotypes. But it sort of demonstrates that country music and country humor is on the sort of edges of things, right? And so there's a kind of voyeurism that goes into the mainstreaming of this stuff, especially in the 60s and in the late 70s, where it feels like part of its importance is that it's not part of the mainstream, that it's coming from the outside. And then we'll see, of course, by the 90s, country music becomes mainstream again, and over the course of the 80s and peaking in the 90s with Garth Brooks, and before that with Kenny Rogers and so on. Merle Haggard, right? Released from San Quentin State Prison in 1960, he turns to a music career with songs about the working class and songs that are somewhat critical of the counterculture, especially his big song, Okie from Muskogee, which we'll talk about in a moment. He had 38 number 1s on the country charts from the 60s through the 80s, right? In 64, he had his first national hit with a song written by Win Stewart called Sing a Sad Song. In 1965, he had his first top 10 hit with My Friends Are Gonna Be Strangers by the songwriter Liz Anderson. And he had several hit songs with her. He wasn't, there's a great story about him meeting Liz Anderson. He walks in, and it's this he thinks of her as basically a housewife sitting at the piano, and he's like, she might be a nice person to have tea with, but how's she going to help my career? And then she goes over and sings a song at the piano, and he's mesmerized. Then another, and he says she sang me 10 to 15 songs that day, and every single one was a hit, and every single one became a hit later, either done by Merle Haggard, many of them done by Merle Haggard, or by someone else. So Liz Anderson's one of the unsung heroes of country music of this period. She wrote many of the really great hits. In 1967, she wrote another song that he released called "I'm a Lonesome Fugitive." She wrote the song, but it became his first number one, and it really became part of his kind of image. This is why he's so inspirational for the outlaw country style that's going to emerge with Willie Nelson in the 1970s. Because he creates this persona. He doesn't hide the fact that he was in jail. He doesn't exactly brag about it either. But when interviewers ask him about it, he doesn't hide it. Now, in the 50s and the 60s, that is not the kind of thing one would brag about. It's usually the kind of thing that record companies would encourage you to hide, to dissemble, to lie about, right? It's not until the 70s that this outlaw image in country becomes so central. Right, the bad boy image in country goes back to Jimmy Rogers in the late 20s and early 30s, but it's a different kind of bad boy. Maybe he's toting a gun, but he's not an outlaw. He'll shoot you if you're trying to take his woman, and he cheats on his women and causes other women to cheat on their husbands, and he roams around working on the railroad. That kind of bad fella, right? That kind of bad guy or bad boy. But the outlaw, the actual criminal, that's not something that's celebrated too often in country music until the 70s with outlaw country. And then we'll talk about what that image implies later. But the idea that Haggard was so open about the fact that he had been in jail, and he sees it really as a story of redemption, but you can see that they're playing into that with songs like I'm a Lonesome Fugitive. Then he begins writing his own songs and has number ones with the song Mama Tried, which is about growing up in poverty and obviously mom trying to keep everything together. Sing Me Back Home, which is another prison song of 68. It's a great song. And then Okie from Muskogee of 69, which really promotes conservative middle-class values. And Haggard goes back and forth throughout his entire career about this song, about what it meant, whether it was sarcasm, but it's very critical of hippies and of the idea of smoking pot and dodging the draft. And he's kind of creating this image of the small town in Oklahoma, right, where people are patriotic, where they drink beer and have a good time, and this image of America that we often associate with country music values now. A lot of that is centered around this release. And like I said, he goes back and forth as to how seriously we're supposed to take it. But it seems fairly serious. Listen to the song and you decide. There are some very clearly marked pop elements as well, those background singers. But then there are some Bakersfield elements as well. Now, other country artists outside of the Bakersfield sound are really trying to build on a tradition. One of the great examples of that is this fellow here, who's pictured in this picture with one of his great leading lady singers, Dolly Parton, but this is Porter Wagoner. He's sometimes known as Mr. Grand Ole Opry, right? He was one of the main figures on the Grand Ole Opry for a while. His first number one was in 55 with a song called A Satisfied Mind. But he had a huge impact on country music in the 60s, both through his hit singles like Misery Loves Company, which was the number one country song in 62, and through his long-running TV show, The Porter Wagoner Show, which ran from 60 to 81, so 21 years. The show features some of the most important female singers in country music, just a bunch in a row. He started with Norma Jean, who was very celebrated from 60 to 65. Then Jeannie Seely, who has a great career in the latter part of the 60s and very early 70s. Then Dolly Parton, who was, of course, a legend in country music. Dolly Parton had a hard time, in a way, living up to those two previous singers. A lot of people didn't take to Dolly Parton at first, which is perhaps surprising to us. And Wagoner is really instrumental in having built her career, as was Chet Atkins, who really produces some of her early hits. And we'll talk about those as we go. Wagoner convinced RCA Victor, and that's how she meets Chet Atkins, to sign Parton. And Parton and Wagoner have a hit duet with The Last Thing on My Mind in 1967. Her solo song, Just Because I'm a Woman, becomes number 17 country hit in 1968. But that's a fairly minor hit. And in the 60s, her main successes were these duets with Wagoner. They were kind of an extension of their television show. She really doesn't come into her own as a solo artist until the 1970s. And so we'll come back to her when we're in the 70s. Another huge star in country music in the 60s, although a somewhat controversial star, was George Jones. He started recording in the mid-50s. He even had a rockabilly song, It's Terrible, and he knew it was terrible. Some people think it's good. I don't know. Maybe you should listen to it and see what you think. He had a number one country hit with White Lightning in 59, and then he signs to United Artists in 62, and he had his signature hit, She Still Thinks I Care. This is perhaps his most famous. It was 6 weeks as number one country song in the nation. And this really makes his reputation, and he becomes this sort of larger than life character. He's hugely influential and hugely celebrated in the country community, but very mercurial, very unpredictable. He often showed up to gigs entirely drunk, bragged about being drunk on stage, would tell the audience that, who knows how long I'll be out here because, if I might fall over or whatever. He would pass out. Sometimes he'd leave early, and yet somehow that was part of his charm for many people. He was a kind of strange character. He bragged about his infidelity toward his wife, especially after they broke up. On stage, even though country music often is this, there's this image of the stability of the home and of the traditions of the family. But so a very interesting and, like I said, controversial figure. In the early 70s, he has a string of hits singing duets with his wife, Tammy Wynette, and we'll talk about her more in a bit. And that was one of the mainstays of his early career. But as I said later, after he broke up with Tammy Wynette, he didn't always speak so kindly of her, even though apparently he was the abusive one in the relationship. Johnny Cash. The 60s really are his great decade in a lot of ways. He started, of course, in the 50s, and we talked about him a bit last semester at Sun Studios as a rockabilly artist. But he found the strongest decade in the 60s. Early in the decade, he started touring with the Carter Family and did some acting. He had, in 63, a hit with Ring of Fire. We talked a bit about that last semester. That was a number one for 7 weeks and a number 17 pop for a little time in 1963. This was a song written about June Carter, and it was written about falling in love, or it was written by June Carter about falling in love with Johnny Cash and how it felt like she was, falling into a ring of fire. It was originally sung by I think Anita Carter, but of course the famous version was by Johnny Cash. Anita Carter recorded it first, but Cash thought that adding trumpets would make it a hit, and he was right. He actually, if I remember correctly, he said, "I'll give yours so many weeks to hit number one, and then I'm going to do a version of it." He said that to Anita, and then when hers didn't become a number one hit, he re-recorded it with the trumpets. He had that sound in his head and wanted to. It's an interesting sound. He released a concept album in 64, so not long after that, even though it sounds entirely different in some ways from Ring of Fire, the music on that. This is called Bitter Tears. It's about the plight of Native Americans, and this became a lifelong cause for him. He really identified, or felt that he identified with Native Americans in And there's sort of he in on that album he offers kind of alternate history to the official in the 60s at least the official school book history of the Trail of Tears and other major events in Native American history. In 1967, Jackson, a duet with June, won a Grammy. That's a great tune. In 1968, he had a rebirth experience, and he proposed to June Carter. At this time, prior to that, he was with her for a long time, but he had been married to another woman and left her for June Carter. And then he has two live prison albums that are very central to his image. Again, we're leading toward that kind of glorification of the outlaw. There's Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, and then Johnny Cash at San Quentin. The Folsom Prison album from '68 is an amazing album. It's again, it's interesting in the way it's mixed. There's that line from one of his songs where he says, "I shot a man in Reno." It's Folsom Prison Blues is the song. "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." And apparently, in the original live recording, everyone was quiet during that because they knew it was a dangerous line and they were afraid that the warden might object to them cheering it. But it was remixed by the studio to have it sound like they were cheering at that line. So this bit of controversy was created within the recording that wasn't necessarily there. But they were both number one albums on the country charts. And the latter, the San Quentin album, which I think is the less good of the two, the lesser of the two, but still, that reached number one on the pop album charts also. From 69 to 71, he had the Johnny Cash Show on ABC, so a major achievement there. And, some of the famous moments include him singing with Bob Dylan and other artists. Tammy Wynette is sometimes thought of as the first lady of country. From 1968 to 69, she had 5 number one hits, including Divorce, right? And then her signature tune is Stand By Your Man. So 2 very different tunes. The first, of course, advocating something that in middle America, and especially in the country traditional view of the family, would have been somewhat scandalous, the idea of divorce. Right, but on the other hand, you have this notion that the strength of the woman is the ability to stand by the man who may be more or less reliable here, right? And again, that it's such an interesting tune. Some people dismiss it as being a kind of retrograde tune, that all it's about is this idea of a woman standing by her man and not having any identity of her own, not having any strength of her own. And that's not entirely true. When you listen to the lyrics, and especially when you listen to the way she sings the song, the verses have all these sort of cracked vocals, like it is demonstrating a kind of lack of security, a lack of being sure of one's identity. But then that chorus, that Stand By Your Man, it's this soaring chorus, no breaks in the voice, this aria-like performance. And it seems to me there's more going on in that song than simply a retrograde, non-feminist take on a woman standing. So it was one of the best-selling singles by a country music artist, by a female country music artist in all of country music history. It's one of the great selling singles.